Welcome to the video presentation for Chapter 3, and we're going to talk about some very basic steps of how we start to process crime scenes. So we're moving away from personnel and away from a discussion of first responders and the first steps to what are some of the basic rules of crime scene investigation. One of the most important things to remember is that these rules can be gray. So sometimes you have to alter the rules based upon the crime scene that's presented to you and have to change things up, but these are some general rules that apply. So we'll dig into these. Sometimes things are very apparent, sometimes you have to dig in deeper. Cicero said the first duty of man is seeking after and the investigation of truth. Again, I can't reiterate that more. That's the purpose of an investigation, to find the truth, so to gather facts. It is not to find someone guilty, it could find someone innocent. So it's just to find whatever the truth may be. So in this particular video presentation, we're going to look at three elements to determine who handles a crime scene, and it can vary from department to department. Examine who within, the three elements that determine that and who may do that. We'll talk about 7 objectives of crime scene investigation, the importance of teamwork. We'll talk about general guidelines associated with crime scenes, 3 essential conditions for success, the first steps of processing media as well. Who processes a scene depends a lot. It depends upon whatever resources that department may have. So you have a small department that has 10 people, you're not going to have a crime scene investigations unit. You have a larger department like the Kansas City Police Department, they have a crime scene investigation unit that solely does this, so they can hop from place to place. The seriousness of the crime too. I referred to in a past video presentation the fact that we're not going to send out the crime scene investigation team to every vandalism that occurs, but we will to larger crimes like homicides and armed robberies. The extent and the size of the scene plays a role too. So a big scene with a large crime, we have a burglary with $100,000 in loss, we may send somebody to that as opposed to a burglary where all that was taken was an Xbox. Who handles the crime scene? So again, it depends. Some places have crime scene techs. Some places have detectives who handle the crime scene investigation. And in some smaller jurisdictions, it may be the officer, the police officer who was that first responder. They may carry it from beginning to end. What are we trying to do with the crime scene investigation? Again, it's all about uncovering, recovering evidence that exists. Uncovering, there we go. So we want to reconstruct the incident with that evidence that we find, ascertain the sequence of events, so in what stages and steps did the crime occur, talk about the mode of operation or how the criminal perpetrated the crime, and for that, hopefully look for a motive. So why did they do this? That may be important for court purposes. If it's a theft, we want to figure out what was stolen. We want to find out all that the criminal did while they were at the scene to the extent possible. And finally, recover physical evidence. In order to properly process a crime scene, we're going to have multiple parts of the department and people who work outside of the department to cooperate and help out. So as we talked about in the last section, uniformed first responding officers. We also need detectives who will do the follow-up investigation. The crime scene investigator, forensic specialist basically means people who have special roles, whether it be in the crime lab or in responding to the scenes, that sort of thing. Medical examiner that we talked about too, or a coroner. And the prosecuting attorney does not work for the police department, they work for the courts. But we need them to help out too because they're actually going to have to prosecute the. One of the most important things to do in a crime scene in most cases, and again I always qualify it because again these rules are general rules and they could change. Calmly and deliberately. You want to do it very cautiously. There's usually no need to process a crime scene quickly, with a couple of exceptions, like an outdoor scene where inclement weather is rolling in, or perhaps a fatal accident on Interstate 70, where you're kind of forced to quickly handle the scene, get it cleaned up so traffic can resume. But otherwise, calmly and deliberately is the key. Try not to bring in preconceived notions about what probably occurred, because often you'll find that wasn't the case. And don't draw premature conclusions based upon pieces of evidence that you've located. Kind of like Murphy's Law, if you expect the worst and just try to really over process the scene, so be extremely thorough, you're not going to miss anything. It's better to have over processed than to under processed. You can't really go back in many cases and reprocess a scene, because once you've released it, it's become contaminated. Appearance and perceptions are very important. It's not uncommon to have the media at crime scenes, so you must remain very professional, because they're videotaping and audio taping everything that's done. So here it is stated for a third time that these rules are guidelines, and every crime scene requires its own approach, because no two crime scenes are exactly alike. So you'll encounter some that are somewhat different, where you're going to have to process them more quickly, or you're going to have to do one step before you do another that you wouldn't normally do that way. Investigators are human and mistakes are possible. That's something to remember. Just because a mistake is made does not mean the case is lost. It just means that you have to be very open and honest with the prosecutor and the judge and the jury at some point. So you can imagine, what do we need out of a good crime scene investigator? A good set of intuition, where they know, or kind of can look at a scene and just kind of be able to picture things and how they may have occurred. It can help them. And to know what needs to be done in each case, knowledge of proper methods. So knowledge is very important. Some of the best crime scene investigators used to be criminal investigators or detectives in a past career, where they kind of knew what to look for in a crime scene. But you can develop that over time too, just by seeing experience. Always looking for the evidence. Okay, before you even start the crime scene investigation, it's good to take a minute and ask yourself a few questions. Try to figure out, what route are we going to use in order to start the search. Where are we going to start? What room are we going to start in? Should we start from the outward in, inward out? Photography is one of the first steps that we'll talk about in greater detail later in the course, and we kind of need to identify what needs to be photographed in what order, and where can we find potential physical evidence. Just determining what is evidence is very tough. You see a tire iron in a garage, and you wonder to yourself, is that a part of the crime or not? So, tough call sometimes. Again, photography and videotape of the overall crime scene is a good start. You want to capture the crime scene as near to the condition it was when you found it as possible. So if you photograph it, even if somebody moves something, you still have a documentation of what the scene looked like upon arrival. Preliminary sketching may be done as well. We'll talk further detail about sketching too. We talked about notes last week as well, and notes will be part of that. What did you first observe? So whenever you go back and commit those notes to a report, and then you go to trial, you can refer to those notes and kind of know what the situation was when you were contacted and arrived. Again, the order of a crime scene is not set in stone, and flexibility may have to happen and may be possible. You usually start at the central scene, or where you found the primary scene, unless you have to process some sort of suspect or victim route. So you find a body in a field, you may proceed directly to that body, but if you have a good established potential route that you think the suspect took, it may behoove you to go ahead and take a look at the route to see if they dropped something. Perishable evidence is something that's very important. So going back to that field, if you have some blood that you can see on blades of grass, and then you see rain moving in too, you might want to go to that blood on the grass and start working on it. The body is not typically the starting point. I think, again, you might want to look around the area and see what you may have to process leading up to the body. The three essential conditions for success are organization, doing things in an organized fashion, not haphazardly, thoroughness, and we kind of talked about being over thorough being important, and just caution, being very careful about. So easy to inadvertently destroy evidence, whether it be a shell casing, some blood, a fingerprint, so you have to be extremely cautious. One of the ways that crime scene investigators work, again, you don't want to go with preconceived notions, but sometimes the evidence presents itself in such a way that you can kind of eliminate different scenarios as you go along, and other scenarios or alternatives that you may be looking at tend to be supported by the evidence that's presented. So, uh, one of the things that you try to determine with a suspicious body case is, was this a homicide? Was it a suicide? And certain evidence that you locate may point toward a suicide. And doesn't mean that you have a suicide, it's just you kind of see how the evidence starts to play out. Outdoor scenes are tough when it's at night because light is our friend in crime scene investigation. Again, identifying those small pieces of trace evidence is tough. So, in a lot of cases, when you have a night scene, it may behoove you to wait until the daylight hours come around to help you identify that evidence. We talked about the fact that the medical examiner or the coroner has jurisdiction over the body, so we don't move bodies merely out of consideration for the families because it could hurt the investigation. Obviously, you want to move a body as soon as you can, but it's very important to be very thorough about processing the body. A trash pile is a section in the outside of the inner perimeter. Remember, we talked about inner and outer perimeters. Outside of the inner perimeter often we'll have a little pile or a bag or something where we can dispose of things that were used in the course of the crime scene investigation and collection of evidence that need to be disposed of. When you have two investigators, and that's normally how we process a crime scene, it's best to have them work with each other and not separately. So you don't send them to two different rooms and say, you do that room and I'll do this room. You kind of feed off of each other, and one of the best ways to do it is A does the examination of the evidence, or picking it up, or moving it, or whatever it may be, while B takes notes and documents things, including photography. So they may take photos before, as you do it, and then after you collect evidence. The detectives, who are often cases not the crime scene investigators, in some cases they are, if they're two different people, it's important that they work together. The detective can take testimonial evidence that they heard from witnesses and describe that to the crime scene investigator who's collecting the physical. Again, documentation is important as you move through, including photography, the location, the description, and the sketch in your notes, and photography with and without scale. So what that means is most crime scene investigators, or pretty much all of them, have some sort of ruler in their bag that they use to place next to pieces of evidence so you can actually look at that evidence and see how large or small it was. You can really never have too detailed of notes or case reports because it may be years that you refer to them and have to remember what happened. Before you wrap things up, it's very good to powwow, get the team together who is processing the crime scene, and ask, is there anything that we should do before we give up this crime scene? Because again, once you walk away, you can't come back because contamination has happened. You can, but it brings up questions in court later when the defense attorney says, is this really valid evidence because you had left this crime scene secured for 24 hours before you return? Just brings those questions to mind. The media should never be allowed into the scene without permission. I can think of very few instances when you would want the media to have access to a crime scene because, again, the more people who come in there unnecessarily, the more you have the potential that you can cause contamination. Don't give out essential information. In many cases, that's how investigators determine that they have the right suspect, is by asking them a question that they know only someone who had been at that crime scene would know that piece of information. So it could be a piece of physical evidence that was discovered, like a screwdriver. Only somebody who was there would have known. Hard work pays off. So you can see the harder you try, eventually it pays off, and a little bit of ingenuity as well.